Today I'm going to go over talent and glyph changes for Prot Pallies in Cataclysm. At the end I'll show some potential builds. Check out my video Prot Paladin spell changes in Cataclysm first so you understand how all of the spells work before watching this one. Throughout this video I'll reference the relative strength of talents in terms of damage, and I'm using the analysis of Thek from the main Tankadon forum for that. This was the premier theory crafting hub for Prot Pallies in OG Kata. One thing to note is that the sims done with the final versions of spells and talents were also done with Dragon Soul gear, so their sims may vary from what we see early in Kata. For this reason, I'm just going to stick to generalizations of the damage of each talent rather than focusing on a specific ranking. I expect some fluctuations based on phase and classic, but not significant ones. First off, the talent system gets an overall revamp. You'll now choose what spec you want to be at level 10, which will give you some new abilities right away. For Prot Pallies, this will be Avenger's Shield, Vengeance, Touched by the Light, and Judgments of the Wise. You'll get your Mastery Divine Bulwark at level 80. Touched by the Light will increase your spell power by 60% of your strength, but now also gives plus 15% stam and 8% spell hit. Judgments of the Wise causes Judgment to give a 30% mana restore over 10 seconds buff, which is our replacement for the Perma Divine Plea from the Wrath version of Guarded by the Light. So right at level 10 you'll have all of these things. This is one of my favorite changes in Kata because you actually get to be the spec you want to be immediately instead of having to wait. At level 10 you'll also get a talent point, and then every odd numbered level after that you'll get an additional one, and points at every level 81 through 85. The talent trees have also been condensed back to 31 point trees, but each talent point is more impactful than before. In the first tier of Prot, we have Divinity, Seals of the Pure, and Eternal Glory as options. Divinity still increases our healing done and received. Seals of the Pure still increases our seal damage and judgment damage of that seal, despite the wording change, and it's now a Prot talent instead of Holy. Eternal Glory gives a chance for Word of Glory to not consume Holy Power, but this talent will almost never be taken by Prot. Let's break it down a little bit. Word of Glory has a 20-second cooldown, so a second immediate cast of Word of Glory is not a possibility. This talent is basically giving us a chance to do more damage by getting an Inquisition or Shield of the Righteous cast we wouldn't have otherwise gotten. Even assuming Word of Glory use every time it's available, which frequently is not the case, it ranks as one of the weakest single target damage talents. The one time you would pick it up is for progging a fight where you'll be using Seal of Insight the majority of the fight, or at least for the hardest part of the fight. We'll almost always go 3 Divinity and 2 Seals of the Pure on this tier. In the second tier, we have Judgments of the Just, Toughness, and Impodge. Judgments of the Just still causes Judgment to reduce the target's attack speed like before, but no longer reduces Hodge cooldown or increases stun duration of Seal of Justice, since Seal of Justice now slows instead of stuns. Toughness still increases armor, but no longer reduces the duration of slows. Impodge still reduces the cooldown of Hodge. Typically you'll only go for Judgments of the Just and Toughness on this tier, but Impodge is occasionally useful for specific fights. The third tier is where the talents start to get really good because they're now out of reach for other specs and are Prot only. On this tier we have Hallowed Ground, Sanctuary, Hammer of the Righteous, and Wrath of the Lightbringer. Hallowed Ground will increase the damage of Consecration and reduce its mana cost significantly. Hallowed Ground makes Consecration way more usable, and is strong if AoE is important, but it's weak for single target damage. Sanctuary is a passive that replaces Blessing of Sanctuary. It reduces your chance to be crit by melee attacks by 6%, reduces all damage taken by 10%, and gives you 3% of your mana back every time you block or dodge. Defense is no longer a stat, and every tank now has a 6% reduced chance to be crit talent. Hammer of the Righteous has changed a bit from Wrath, now does damage to your current target and a frontal to anything near the target. It has a 3-second cooldown and is your primary AoE ability. Wrath of the Lightbringer increases Crusader Strike and Judgment damage significantly, and increases the crit chance of Holy Wrath and Hammer of Wrath. This talent is our highest single target damage increase by a huge margin, so for this tier we go 3 in Sanctuary, 1 in Hammer of the Righteous, and 2 in Wrath of the Lightbringer. Hallowed Ground is optional. It's one of the worst talents in the tree for single target damage. For AoE it's solid, so it really depends on what you're doing. If you're doing tons of heroics, it's a good pickup, but if you're progging heroic raid bosses, generally you don't need it. For the fourth tier, we have Reckoning, Shield of the Righteous, and Grand Crusader. Reckoning changed a bit from Wrath. It's now a higher proc chance, but procs only off blocks instead of proccing off blocks and normal hits. In Wrath, it was up to a 10% chance, but you'd get a dodge, parry, or miss on about 40 to 55% of attacks, depending on the phase. So that left only 45 to 60% of attacks eligible to even proc it. In Kata, prot values will be stacking tons of block chance through mastery, and even early on will already be in the higher end of that 45 to 60% Wrath window of Reckoning proc eligibility. But in Kata, the proc chance can be doubled to 20% by putting 2 points in, so you'll see far more Reckoning procs in Kata compared to Wrath. Both the first and second point in Reckoning are among our highest single target damage points. Shield of the Righteous got changed and is now a Holy Power spender, basically Pally's version of Eviscerate. Grand Crusader gives you a chance when you Crusader Strike or a Hammer of the Righteous to reset the cooldown on Avenger's Shield. You'll often pick up everything in this tier. In the 5th tier, we have Vindication, which is now a Prot talent instead of Ret. It causes Crusader Strike and Hammer of the Righteous to reduce physical damage done by 10% for 30 seconds, instead of being an attack power reduction that lasts 10 seconds, and having a chance to proc off of a variety of things like in Wrath. This new version is of course more consistent. You won't run into situations where Vindication sometimes falls off. I should also note that the AP debuff type no longer exists, and the 10% reduced physical damage fully replaces that debuff type. Holy Shield is now a 30-second cooldown that increases the amount you block for by 20%, instead of having a shorter cooldown and increasing the chance to block and having charges. The passive block you get from Mastery will eventually make up for losing the 30% block from Holy Shield. Blocks are now also a 30% damage reduction instead of a flat value. With the metagem that will typically be used, it's bumped up to 31%, and Holy Shield will bring it to 51%. It's a really good cooldown, and you'll be using it constantly with the short CD compared to other damage reduction cooldowns. Guarded by the Light has been completely reworked. It now increases the amount your Word of Glory heals for, and putting a second point in also unlocks a secondary effect where overhealing done by Word of Glory will give you an Absorb Shield for 6 seconds. This can be useful right before a tank buster that might otherwise kill you. Divine Guardian also got changed a bit. It no longer has the Divine Sacrifice component that transferred damage. Its cooldown got increased to 3 minutes, and it no longer gives the damage reduction effect to the pally who cast it. So we can no longer situationally use this as a personal defensive. It's also so deep down the prot tree that only prot pallies can bring it, so it is one of the big benefits of having a prot pally. For this tier, you'll generally take Vindication, Holy Shield, and Divine Guardian. Guarded by the Light will only be taken for fights where you really need to min-max your survivability as much as possible. The next tier has Sacred Duty, which got completely changed. It now gives your Judgment and Avenger's Shield a chance to make your next Shield of the Righteous a guaranteed crit. This is one of the top single target DPS talents. Shield of the Templar also got completely changed. It now reduces the cooldown of Avenging Wrath by 60 seconds, bringing it to 2 minutes, and Guardian of Ancient Kings by 120 seconds, bringing it to 3 minutes, and it causes Divine Plea to generate 3 Holy Power. Both of these talents are must-haves. The final talent is Ardent Defender, which has changed significantly. It's now an active ability that reduces damage taken by 20% for 10 seconds and causes the first attack that would otherwise kill you to instead heal you for 15% of your max HP. Its cooldown has also been increased to 3 minutes. The passive version was pretty overpowered, and this version is a lot more balanced but still really good. Now let's look at the Ret tree. Eye for an Eye no longer requires you to be crit and works on most magic attacks in the game, so it can provide a decent damage boost depending on incoming magic damage. Crusade now increases the damage of Crusader Strike and Hammer of the Righteous instead of an overall damage increase. This is middle of the pack for single target damage and one of the top for AoE damage. Improved Judgments just increases the range of judgment. 3 Crusade is always taken, but Improved Judgment versus Eye for an Eye depends on preference, and you may swap them around depending on the specific fight you're working on. The second tier has Guardian's Favor, which used to be a prot talent, but it still works the same. Reduces the cooldown on Hand of Protection and increases the duration of Hand of Freedom. Rule of Law increases the crit chance of Crusader Strike, Hammer of the Righteous, and Word of Glory. It's middle of the pack for single target damage, strong for AoE damage, and has the added benefit of potential extra healing. Pursuit of Justice is similar to the Wrath version, but now grants Holy Power when you're hit by an Immobilize, Stun, or Fear, in addition to the movement speed increase, but it no longer reduces disarm duration. For this tier, Rule of Law will pretty much always be taken, and Pursuit of Justice depends on preference. Finally, let's look at Holy. Arbiter of the Light increases crit chance of Judgment and Templar's Verdict, but Templar's Verdict is a red ability, so we don't care about that one. It's one of the weakest single target damage talents and much worse for AoE. Protector of the Innocent isn't useful to us at all. It just causes us to get healed when we heal others, which we don't really do. Judgments of the Pure causes Judgment to increase haste for 1 minute. This is also one of the weakest damage talents. You'll typically only have 2 leftover points, and they could go into Judgments of the Pure or Arbiter of the Light if you're simply trying to maximize damage. Last Word on the second tier gives you a huge bonus to WoG crit chance on low HP targets. It can potentially be useful, but isn't commonly used. Now for glyphs. These have been changed quite a bit. You'll now permanently learn glyphs instead of having to use a new glyph scroll every time you want to change. There is a new item required to make a glyph change though. There's also a new tier of glyph called Prime Glyphs. In the Prime Glyph slot, prop allies have a few options. The Hammer of the Righteous glyph will increase its damage, which is fantastic for AoE. The Shield of the Righteous glyph increases its damage and is one of our best single target glyphs. Glyph of Judgment increases our damage and is likely to be our weakest single target glyph. Glyph of Crusader Strike increases its crit chance and is decent for single target. Glyph of Seal of Truth is the same as the old Glyph of Seal of Vengeance, increasing our expertise by 10 while the seal is active. This is by far our best glyph. Glyph of Word of Glory increases its healing. This is decent for a fight where you have to min-max your survivability at all costs. Glyph of Seal of Insight increases your healing, which again is only going to be used if you need to min-max every bit of survivability you can. The typical prime glyphs you'll use are Seal of Truth, Shield of the Righteous, and Crusader Strike for single target. For AoE, you can substitute Hammer of the Righteous for Crusader Strike. The major glyph slot has a ton of options, but I'm only going to focus on the ones that are most often used. Glyph of Rebuke makes it cost 0 mana. This can be useful for an interrupt heavy fight or for heroics. Glyph of Divine Protection is pretty interesting, as it will remove the physical damage reduction from Divine Protection, but increase its magic damage reduction to 40%. This can be good for bosses with heavy magic damage and lower physical damage. Glyph of Consecration increases its duration and cooldown by 20%. This is a small damage increase, so you can take it if you're trying to maximize damage, since there are only 2 glyphs in the major tier that affect damage. Glyph of Focus Shield increases the damage of Avenger Shield, but makes it a single target ability. This is one of the strongest single target damage glyphs, and it's a major instead of a prime, so it isn't even competing with the other good ones. If you're trying to maximize single target damage, this is an important pickup, but will reduce AoE damage. Glyph of Salvation removes the permanent threat drop from Hand of Salve, but causes the target to generate 0 threat for the duration. This can be useful for situations where you'll have little threat on a faraway mob, for example, but a DPS can fully blast it without ripping threat. Glyph of Lay on Hands reduces the cooldown by 3 minutes, making it a 7-minute cooldown. Lay is always really useful, so getting to cast it more often is solid. Glyph of Dazing Shield now adds the slow back to Avenger Shield. Situationally, you may want this for guiding. Glyph of Holy Wrath causes it to stun elementals and dragonkin, in addition to undead and demons. There are tons of elementals and dragons in Kata, so this situationally can be useful. The major tier is mostly utility stuff, so you'll change these up somewhat frequently to whatever makes the most sense in the moment. But the ones you'll probably use the most are Focus Shield, Lay on Hands, Consecration, Rebuke, and Divine Protection. For minor glyphs, they all just reduce the mana cost of a seal or blessing by 50%. Seal of Truth will be your main seal, so you'll likely grab that. Seal of Insight will sometimes be swapped to, so you could also grab that to make seal swapping less costly. For blessings, you can either grab both of these glyphs and forgo Seal of Insight, or you can just grab the blessing you find yourself buffing the most. Lastly, let's look at some builds. This first build is the one I'm likely going to run the most. It maximizes single target damage with flex points, picking up 2 points in Reckoning, Eye for an Eye, and Judgments of the Pure. We get 1 point in Hallowed Ground since there isn't another damage option, but this single point can make Consecration much more manageable for our mana. For glyphs, we're getting all of the ones that increase our single target damage the most: Seal of Truth, Shield of the Righteous, Crusader Strike, Focus Shield, and Consecration. This next build is a prog build. For this, we're spending the flex points on utility and survivability. The main thing here is picking up Guarded by the Light for increased survivability. For glyphs, I've swapped out the lowest damage glyph we had, Crusader Strike, for increased Word of Glory healing. If it's a fight where you're going to be using Seal of Insight instead of Seal of Truth, you could also swap those. The last build is an AoE build. I've primarily made this one for spamming heroics. With the flex points, we're maxing Reckoning and Hallowed Ground. Consecration is a lot more important in heroics than single target boss fights, so increasing its damage and reducing its mana cost by 80% is a huge benefit. With 2 points in Reckoning, we'll have nearly 100% uptime on Reckoning while tanking 4 to 6 mobs at a time. I've picked up Imp Judgment since it's just nice to have another long-ranged way to pick up a mob. For glyphs, we're picking up Hammer of the Righteous, which is incredibly good for AoE. We're also going Shield of the Righteous just because there isn't a good AoE option. It's far more single target damage than the Judgment Glyph, but the Judgment Glyph will give you a small benefit in both AoE and single target. So it's up to you if you'd rather have the small benefit all the time or the huge benefit just for bosses. Keep in mind, these are all just general build recommendations, and you'll of course tailor it more specifically for the fights you're actually doing. For example, if you're progging a boss where increased judgment range doesn't matter, and the boss does a lot of spell damage, you'd swap Imp Judgment to Eye for an Eye. If you're standing still the entire boss fight and movement speed doesn't matter, you'll get rid of Pursuit of Justice for what makes the most sense for what you are personally doing. No one build will be the best for every situation. That should cover pretty much everything. If you'd like to support me, you can help me out by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.